Okay, so we're talking about Sunday, October 28th. Premier Khrushchev uses Radio Moscow to announce that the Soviet Union had agreed to remove the missiles and dismantle the missile bases in Cuba. And with that announcement, the Cuban Missile Crisis had ended. And as soon as it ended, President Kennedy met with his staff and ExComm, and he made the following comment, quote, "You know it's been a long 2 weeks, and or whatever, I'd like to thank you all. I think you all did a great job. But I don't think we should be gloating too much." And the question I asked was, why do you think he said that? Why do you think that the United States shouldn't be gloating too much? And then he finished his quote by saying, it was just as much a victory for them as it was for us. His point being, we shouldn't be gloating about the results of this because they won just as much as we did, and the victory was not going to nuclear war. Okay? Well, President Kennedy then excused himself to his office where he dictated a letter. Okay, he excused himself to his office where he dictated a letter. Who did he dictate the letter to? Anybody want to guess? What? No? He dictated a letter. Now in those days, you had a dictaphone. And it was a thing you talked into, and then in the other room was Evelyn Lincoln, his secretary, who then typed. In those days, you did type the letter, and then he went and signed his name to it. So he used a dictaphone, and he dictated a letter to someone that Evelyn Lincoln was going to write for him. Who did he write that letter to? Think about it. Let's see if we can think above the box. Who did he write? No? No? Think of too high. His dad. Who was the only combat casualty of the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Oh, his family.
He wrote a letter to the parents of Rudolph Anderson. He dictated a letter to the parents of Rudolph Anderson. Because Rudolph Anderson is the only combat casualty of this conflict. So President Kennedy excused himself to his office where he dictated a letter to Rudolph Anderson's parents. In the meantime, and I want you to get this quote down, in the meantime, Kenneth O'Donnell went to his office. He just kind of sat there a little bit in a daze. And finally he picked up a paperweight that was sitting on his desk, and he read the quote off the paperweight. Okay? So Kenneth O'Donnell leaves the meeting and goes to his office, somewhat in a daze, relieved, thankful, thinking back, reflecting on the last 13 or 14 days. And he picked up a paperweight that he had on his desk with the following quote, "O God, thy sea is so great, and my boat is so small." O God, thy sea is so great, and my boat is so small. So on the paperweight that he picks up from his desk is the quote, "O God, thy sea is so great, and my boat is so small." And this might be the way everyone that was involved on both sides of this Cuban Missile Crisis might have thought in October of 1962. You think of that quote, "Oh God, thy sea is so great, and my boat is so small." Anyway, very emotional time for Kenneth O'Donnell. Okay, that moves us on to our next subtopic then. We're basically done with the 13 days of October, and the subtopic is the results of the Cuban Missile Crisis for the United States. Results of the Cuban Missile Crisis for the United States. Now, was the Cuban Missile Crisis important for the United States? Maybe not the crisis itself, but the end result of the crisis became very important for the United States. And I'm going to give you 3 reasons why. So the end result of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the way it turned out, became very important for the United States for 3 reasons. You got to kind of think back on what we've talked about concerning the Cold War. But the first reason that the end result of the Cuban Missile Crisis was important for the United States is in the minds of American citizens, the bold action on the part of President Kennedy made up for what? The disastrous Bay of Pigs affair. So, in the minds of American citizens, the bold action on the part of President Kennedy made up for that entire disaster at the Bay of Pigs. So remember, we were a little concerned about his ability to lead, his inexperience, especially with foreign affairs because he bungled up the Bay of Pigs. Well, in the minds of American citizens, the bold action that he took part in concerning the Cuban Missile Crisis made up for the disaster of the Bay of Pigs. The second reason why the end result of the Cuban Missile Crisis was very important for the United States was the result of the crisis gave the country an uplift against communism. It gave the country an uplift against communism. Remember we talked about that early in the lecture about our view on communism. One of the biggest goals Kennedy had when he took over is to regain America's confidence against communism because we were concerned about that. Well, the result of this crisis gave the entire country the uplift it really needed toward communism. And the third important result was that the end result of the Cuban Missile Crisis showed American citizens that the United States could stand toe-to-toe with the Soviet Union. Because there were people concerned that we could. There were people concerned that the Soviet Union was going to take us over. So the results of the Cuban Missile Crisis showed American citizens that the United States could stand toe-to-toe with the Soviet Union. Now, you can probably figure this out, but if you listen to historians, President Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the greatest example of crisis management in the history of this country. Historians will tell you that the way Kennedy handled the Cuban Missile Crisis was the greatest example of crisis management in this country's history to that point and today. How many chances did he have to screw things up and put us in a world war? Many times. How much pressure did he get? Much pressure. He never buckled. And you talk about crisis management, historians will tell you that Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the greatest example of crisis management in the history of this country. And I'm going to tell you later that President Kennedy was probably much more popular in death than he ever would have been in life. And this is one of the reasons why he is such a popular president, why we still read things about the Kennedy family, why the Kennedy family and his presidency come up so much. The way he handled the Cuban Missile Crisis was an exact example of that. Okay? Now on June 10th, 1963, President Kennedy gave a famous speech entitled the Peace Speech at American University in Washington, D.C. On June 10th, 1963, President Kennedy gave what went down into history as his famous peace speech at American University in Washington, D.C. And the speech was basically dedicated to American attitudes towards the Soviet Union. The speech was basically dedicated to changing American attitudes towards the Soviet Union. So the main topic of his speech was to change American attitudes towards the Soviet Union. Now toward the end of his speech, and I'm going to show you the speech here in just a minute in its entirety, Kennedy wanted to change American attitudes, and this is what he said. Just listen to this. He said, "The most important topic on earth, peace." But this is a line that I thought was great. "For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal." That was the key line to that. Now, you want to know the impact of that speech? For the first time in history, a speech by an American president was on the cover of Pravda, which was the main Soviet newspaper in Russia. So for the first time and the only time in the history of our country, a speech by an American president was covered on a complete page on the cover of Pravda, which was the Soviets' leading newspaper at the time. So again, for the first and only time in history, this speech that Kennedy gave at American University, the peace speech, was covered on a complete page of Pravda, Soviet Union's newspaper. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you that speech. And what I want you to do is is I want you to write down specific points that catch your ear on this speech. And then we're going to ask you to probably write down 5 points that you got out of this speech and turn it in. So let's be prepared here. I am not going to record this. Well, I might record it. We'll see here. This is the commencement address that Kennedy gave at American University on June 10th, 1963. I want you to write down some key points that you think are of importance. Okay, here we go.
President Anderson, members of the faculty, Board of Trustees, distinguished guests, my old colleague, Senator Bob Byrd, who has earned his degree through many years of attending Knight Law School, while I am earning mine in the next 30 minutes, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is with great pride that I participate in this ceremony of the American University, sponsored by the Methodist Church, founded by Bishop John Fletcher Hurst, and first opened by President Woodrow Wilson in 1914. This is a young and growing university, but it has already fulfilled Bishop Hurst's enlightened hope for the study of history and public affairs in a city devoted to the making of history and to the conduct of the public's business. By sponsoring this institution of higher learning for all who wish to learn, whatever their color or their creed, the Methodists of this area and the nation deserve the nation's thanks. And I commend all those who are today graduating. Professor Woodrow Wilson once said that every man sent out from a university should be a man of his nation, as well as a man of his time. And I'm confident that the men and women who carry the honor of graduating from this institution will continue to give from their lives, from their talents, a high measure of public service and public support. There are few earthly things more beautiful than a university, wrote John Masefield in his tribute to English universities, and his words are equally true today. He did not refer to towers or to campuses. He admired the splendid beauty of a university because it was, he said, a place where those who hate ignorance may strive to know, where those who perceive truth may strive to make others see. I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds, and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth, peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age where great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to those forces. It makes no sense in an age where a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by all the Allied air forces in the Second World War. It makes no sense in an age when the deadly poisons produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn. Today, the expenditure of billions of dollars every year on weapons acquired for the purpose of making sure we never need them is essential to the keeping of peace. But surely the acquisition of such idle stockpiles, which can only destroy and never create, is not the only, much less the most efficient, means of assuring peace. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. Some say that it is useless to speak of peace, or world law, or world disarmament, and that it will be useless until the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude. I hope they do. I believe we can help them do it. But I also believe that we must re-examine our own attitudes as individuals and as a nation. For our attitude is as essential as theirs. And every graduate of this school, every thoughtful citizen who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace should begin by looking inward, by examining his own attitude towards the possibilities of peace, towards the Soviet Union, towards the course of the Cold War, and towards freedom and peace here at home. First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. I am not referring to the absolute, infinite concept of universal peace and goodwill, of which some fantasies and fanatics dream. I do not deny the value of hopes and dreams, but we merely invite discouragement and incredulity by making that our only and immediate goal. Let us focus instead on a more practical, more attainable peace, based not on a sudden revolution in human nature, but on a gradual evolution in human institutions, on a series of concrete actions and effective agreements which are in the interests of all concerned. There is no single simple key to this peace, no grand or magic formula to be adopted by one or two powers. Genuine peace must be the product of many nations, the sum of many acts. It must be dynamic, not static, changing to meet the challenge of each new generation. For peace is a process, a way of solving problems. With such a peace, there will still be quarrels and conflicting interests, as there are within families and nations. World peace, like community peace, does not require that each man love his neighbor. It requires only that they live together in mutual tolerance, submitting their disputes to a just and peaceful settlement. And history teaches us that enmities between nations, as between individuals, do not last forever. However fixed our likes and dislikes may seem, the tide of time and events will often bring surprising changes in the relations between nations and neighbors. So let us persevere. Peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it. And second, let us re-examine our attitude towards the Soviet Union. It is discouraging to think that their leaders may actually believe what their propagandists write. It is discouraging to read a recent authoritative Soviet text on military strategy and find on page after page wholly baseless and incredible claims, such as the allegation that American imperialist circles are preparing to unleash different types of war, that there is a very real threat of a preventative war being unleashed by American imperialists against the Soviet Union, and that the political aims, and I quote, of the American imperialists are to enslave economically and politically the European and other capitalist countries and to achieve world domination by means of aggressive war, unquote. Truly, as it was written long ago, the wicked flee when no man pursueth. Yet it is sad to read these Soviet statements, to realize the extent of the gulf between us. But it is also a warning to the American people not to fall into the same trap as the Soviets, not to see only a distorted and desperate view of the other side, not to see conflict as inevitable, accommodation as impossible, and communication as nothing more than an exchange of threats. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered